Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak this evening. I'm really very, very grateful. I'm also very pleased to be able to follow Paul, not only because of his compelling analysis that he's just given about all of the flaws in the government's plans, but also because of his anecdote about the East Coast Main Line. It gives me an opportunity to flag my private member's bill, which is all about trying to bring the railway back into public hands. And if anyone would like to support that, then there's a big demonstration on Friday at 5:30. But that was a bit cheeky. That's another public meeting. And this public meeting is an incredibly important one, very seriously. And I want to congratulate the organisers for doing a great job at getting so many people here in the room. And I expect many of you in the room actually may have been some of the people that have been writing to me about the transforming rehabilitation strategy. And if you are, then thank you very much for taking the time to do so. Because your first-hand experience and expertise is incredibly helpful for my efforts to try to defend the Probation Trust model and to promote the fantastic work of Surrey and Sussex Probation Services at Westminster. Because your letters and emails have been clearly, politely and comprehensively demolishing this government's arguments in favour of outsourcing the probation service to the private sector on the payment by results basis we've just been hearing about, which, as you know, is at the core of these ill-thought-out proposals. That analysis that I've seen from your letters and emails is absolutely backed up from what I've seen and heard during local visits and meetings with Mike and probation workers in the city, with organisations as well, like Brighton Women's Centre, which runs programmes specifically aimed at the rehabilitation of women prisoners, as I'm sure you'll know, and what the future holds for such small-scale but incredibly valuable local projects. What that future would be under these proposals, I think at the very best is unclear and is certainly at risk. So this evening what I want to do is to set out the problems with the government's proposals for the future of probation. I'll try not to repeat too much of what Paul said. I want to talk a bit about my main concerns and then also just mention briefly what might actually be desirable if the government really was serious about transforming rehabilitation in a positive direction. And then finally I'll just touch very briefly on what happens next in terms of the parliamentary process and the opportunities for influence. But as you've heard, the proposals in transforming rehabilitation originate from the coalition agreement commitment to introduce what they called a rehabilitation revolution, with payments to independent providers to reduce reoffending. And actually the first bit, this idea of a rehabilitation revolution, perhaps didn't sound so bad. Ken Clarke, the then Justice Secretary, sounded quite reasonable when he said in June 2010 that prison was, and I quote, a costly and ineffectual approach that fails to turn criminals into law-abiding citizens, and that, and I quote again, we must now take action and shut off this revolving door of crime and reoffending. For me at least, that's not necessarily an incorrect diagnosis, and no one denies that there are some problems, for example, with reoffending rates of prisoners serving 12 months or less, but of course, as we've heard, that's precisely the area for which the probation service hasn't traditionally had a statutory responsibility. But the idea of these payments to independent providers, I think, rightly sets off many alarm bells. And as soon as the proposals for reform were first published, it was clear that the course of treatment that the coalition was prescribing was likely to make things a lot worse rather than better. And particularly baffling, I think, is Minister's intent to get rid of the very part of the system that is performing exceptionally well. Government figures show that the probation service is effective, efficient, and good value for money. That there's been a decrease in reoffending rates of 5.6% in the last 8 years, that probation trusts are meeting or exceeding all of their targets. The service was recently awarded, as you know, the British Quality Foundation Award for Excellence. So all of that suggests to me that the government should be investing in the probation service. It should be even considering extending its role, or at least learning from the successful model to tackle areas of concern, rather than fragmenting and destroying a system which appears to be working very well. And that's why I absolutely concur with what Paul has said about the fact that this is being driven entirely by ideology, not by evidence. Chris Grayling, I think, is willfully blind to the impressive record of the probation service in securing year-on-year reductions in offending rates. Instead, he appears to be blaming the service for high reoffending rates for those in prison under a year, the one bit, as I say, of the system for which the probation service hasn't had statutory responsibility. And so, yes, this is about ideology, and it is the same ideology that we're seeing over and over again from this government when it comes to privatising public services, that whole ideology that automatically says that public is good and private, the other way around, public is bad and private is good. The aspects of the transforming rehabilitation strategy receiving the most attention are the outsourcing of all but the most high-risk cases to the private and voluntary sector providers, payment by results, and as a result of the outsourcing, the creation of a new national probation service with responsibility for the remaining high-risk cases, which are managed centrally, replacing the current locally based structures. And when we're trying to think about some of the impacts, of course, Paul has set out some of those, but I wanted to just refer back to that risk register that he mentioned. It was leaked in June, and its revelations are a real indictment both of the government's policies and of its inability to look at its own evidence, even when it's gone out there to commission it in an impact assessment. So just to reinforce that impact assessment said very, very clearly that there is a more than 80% risk that an unacceptable drop in operational performance will lead to delivery failure and reputational damage. There is between a 51% to 80% risk that insufficient support for the proposals will lead to failure to implement the changes properly and on time. There is a 51 to 80% risk that cost savings will not be met. And I think with figures like that coming from the government's own impact assessment, it's little wonder that members of the House of Lords who've been scrutinising the bill before it comes to the Commons, it's little wonder that they've been giving the proposals a pretty rough ride. In the Commons, Andy Slaughter, the Shadow Justice Minister, has rightly been outspoken in his criticism of the plans on the grounds of cost and in terms of risk to public safety. Chris Grayling's predictably petty response was simply to hit back by saying, well, Labour passed the legislation that made these reforms possible. But I'm actually glad that the official opposition is expressing concern about the involvement of the private sector to this degree and indeed about payment by results. And there is welcome cross-party support for an early day motion that was put down last year, which highlighted the achievements of the probation service in England and Wales and commended its effective and efficient work. But on payment by results, I'm not sure that it is entirely true to say, as Andy Slaughter did, that the impact of that is untried and untested. It is untried and untested within probation, but it's certainly not untried and untested more broadly. And we've seen, again, as Paul said, the failure of that very model in the welfare system, where outsourcing and competitive tendering is causing unforgivable harm to the lives of thousands of people who are genuinely looking for work, for example, and yet failing to do so precisely because of the way in which this payments by results system has been set up. On the other hand, it does appear to be delivering a healthy profit to the giant firms involved. I'm sure that's no coincidence. And I think there's a real risk that payment by results could incentivise private firms to concentrate on offenders with fewer reconvictions. In other words, those who can be most easily notched up as successes, rather than the more difficult cases that should be the higher priority. And of course, that's mirrored in NHS reform, where we're hearing stark warnings from health professionals that private providers may focus on the cheap and easy to treat patients whilst leaving the expensive, more difficult stuff to the NHS. So either that will be a result, or payment by results will turn out to be even more of a charade, simply a way of transferring public funds to private companies and their shareholders in exchange for a poorer quality service. Now, alongside concerns over perverse incentives resulting from payment by results, there are also good reasons to question more fundamentally what contribution the private sector can make in the field of probation and rehabilitation. Last weekend, we heard Labour Shadow Health Secretary Andy Burnham concede that it was a mistake for the last Labour government to allow the private sector into the NHS. He said, and I quote, "Once the market takes a hold on the system, it will destroy what's precious about it. We had been building a policy that had been saying it doesn't matter who provides healthcare so long as it's free at the point of delivery, but I'm saying it does matter." All of that is a quote from Andy Burnham. And so I think it is a good time now for politicians from all parties to recognise that the same goes for privatising the probation service. Fundamentally, I simply don't believe that the private sector, especially not companies like Serco or G4S or Sodexo, have the answers to how we make further progress in reducing reoffending or public safety through the supervision of ex-prisoners. I think it's people like those of you here in this room that have that knowledge and understanding. And I think public understanding of this is growing as well, thanks to campaigning by NAPO and others, that it really is helping people to see what it would mean for so much of the services work with so-called low and medium risk offenders to be outsourced to the private sector. as Mike has starkly put it, medium risk offenders are predominantly men, convicted of violence, sexual offences, burglary, robbery, domestic violence. They're not an easy group to work with. And I think ministers have grossly miscalculated public opposition to their plans. It's one thing to give expert charities like NACRO a greater role and to introduce changes that make the most of the skills of the voluntary and community sector and social enterprises. But in reality, it will be the big companies who will be in a position to bid for the new substantial contracts, the very same companies that, as we know, spectacularly failed even to provide adequate security for the Olympic Games. And I think the general public is becoming fed up of ministers washing their hands of responsibility for vital public services and handing contracts to private sector mega corporations in a race to the bottom, driven essentially by market fundamentalism. It's as if those writing strategies in the Ministry of Justice have given little thought for practicalities on the ground either. Now, I'm not claiming for a moment to be an expert, but it does appear that there are major unresolved issues with the practical implementation of the plans, as well as their ideological basis. For example, for payments by results to work, you need a robust way to really measure cause and effect when it comes to whether a person reoffends or not. But doing that is very, very complex. Furthermore, we won't have a proper idea of whether the pilot but voluntary scheme in Peterborough is working until 2015. That's well after the changes are supposed to be introduced, and I can see no justification for the aggressive timetable that is being followed. Will the new fragmented system be able to cope with the reality that risk categories change? A person might be medium risk one day but high risk the next, or vice versa. These aren't simply nice, easy categories that don't change. And will coordination become more of a problem too? I think it will. It will mean that the new structure makes it more difficult for the new national service, privatised local providers and other key bodies like local voluntary organisations, the police and health services, to work together for an efficient system that is joined up and effective. The government has comprehensively failed to provide convincing answers to any of these concerns. And those answers that can be found, for example, in their own leaked documents, serve to add weight to the legitimacy, I think, of their critics' concerns. So let me end very quickly by mentioning a couple of examples of positive changes that I would like to see, which has been the focus of some of my work at Westminster. First, I believe strongly that policies should prioritise rehabilitation and community sentencing over custodial sentences where possible, in light of the wealth of evidence that these are preferable in terms of reduction of reoffending. Secondly, I've been pushing for the national rollout of local schemes that have been successful in Brighton and Hove, schemes such as those run by the Inspire project, providing caseworkers and services to address unemployment and improve literacy, directly addressing the causes of women offending. And I think that's one illustration of where community provision can help women rebuild their lives and benefit the wider community as well. During the passage of the Crime and Courts Bill, I supported amendments backed by the Prison Reform Trust that would have ensured that women's probation services like this were consistently available right throughout the country. And last month in the House of Lords, the government did concede that the particular needs of women do need to be given the force of law. It amended the Offender Rehabilitation Bill to require the Secretary of State to ensure that all arrangements comply with the public sector equality duty as it relates to female offenders. I think that's a really welcome step forward and a tribute to the determined campaigning, not least by the Prison Reform Trust support and women's organisations. So what now? Well, some of the proposals in the Transforming Rehabilitation Strategy are contained in this Offender Rehabilitation Bill, which is due to start its journey through the Commons this autumn. As I say, it's already started off in the Lords. Its clauses cover the extension of the rehabilitation period to offenders who've served short sentences, measures that can be imposed during this period, and changes to community and suspended sentence orders. Some of that is not as problematic as others. But some of the most controversial changes actually aren't included in the bill. Payment by results, privatisation of lower medium risk cases, the abolition of the current probation trust model to be replaced in part by this centrally controlled National Probation Service are nowhere to be seen in the bill. And that's why it's so important that a number of MPs have been calling for proper parliamentary scrutiny and a vote in both houses of Parliament before any reorganisation or privatisation of the probation service in England and Wales. And that's why I agree with Paul that does give us a real opportunity, I think, to go out there and to lobby more MPs. I think the more they know about it and the more they have constituents raising it with them and the more they have all of you really giving your expert advice, then I think there really is a chance that we could stop this really grotesque set of proposals in their tracks. So Let me thank you for all of the work that you do in the city. Let me thank you for all of the lobbying you'll do to raise this issue, and let me absolutely commit to do anything that I can and everything that I can to support you in doing that.